Welcome to our podcast, Travel Unravelled, an ISTM podcast sponsored by the International Society of Travel Medicine and IAMAT, the International Association for Medical Assistance to Travelers. Before travel medicine was a defined discipline, it was a patchwork of various specialties in primary care medicine and infectious diseases. Then, in 1988, a group of visionary clinicians came together with a bold idea to create a global community focused on the health of travelers. That idea became the International Society of Travel Medicine, or lovingly known as the ISTM. Today, the ISTM connects thousands of practitioners across more than 100 countries, shaping how we think about everything from malaria prevention to climate-driven disease risk. But how did it all begin? In this episode, we go back to the roots of travel medicine with the people who built it. Joining me on Travel Unravelled is our lovely host and ISTM president, Dr. Anne McCarthy. Hi, Anne. How are you?
I'm very good, Aisha. Thanks. Glad to be here. How are you doing?
Good. I'm great.
So you can put up your hands and say hi as I introduce you. First is Robert Steffen, who's affectionately referred to as now the grandfather, one of the grandfathers of travel medicine. When I started, he was a father of travel medicine. He is from Zurich, and he's a founding member of ISTM, which we'll hear a lot about in the next 45 minutes or so, has been remarkably involved in research within travel medicine, the JTM, and much, much more. Dr. Bert DuPont, and really a driving force for our journal of travel medicine. And he is in Houston, Texas. He is a world-renowned authority on traveler's diarrhea. We always talk about traveling, broadening your mind and loosening your bowels. And I'm sure that's come from a few papers that he's been involved in. Dr. Phyllis Kozarsky is from Emory University and the CDC. She's one of the founders of ISTM, a co-founder of GeoSentinel, and really a driving force of GeoSentinel, which we've talked about on one of our podcasts. Nancy Jenks is a family nurse practitioner. She has been involved a lot with research related to travel medicine and refugees in particular, but also very involved in education and the travel medicine review course. Welcome, Nancy.
Thank you. It's so great to be here with everyone.
Why don't we start with just talking about what was the origins of the first international conference related to travel medicine, but it wasn't the first ISTM conference. That was the conference in Zurich, I believe, in 1988.
Take us back to the beginning. We want to hear about how this was, when this was a twinkle in the eye, essentially.
Well, the apple was ripe for it because various groups had done research in the 70s and 80s. And then I had two pivotal encounters. The first one with Bert DuPont, who is here present. I met him in 1982, I believe it was, at a meeting. I was presenting a paper on the epidemiology of traveler's diarrhea, and he was presenting on the microbiology. We immediately realized that we had common interests and became friends and continued to collaborate until now. The second pivotal encounter was with Hans Lobel. That was in the mid-1980s at the Roche headquarters. And that meeting was actually called upon because their anti-malarial chemoprophylactic agent had been associated with severe cutaneous adverse events. And at that meeting, we realized again that we had common interests. And so we continued until Hans passed away some 10 years ago, I believe. And in the discussions at some stage, we said, well, why don't we all get together? And so we started to plan an international conference. Possibly one anecdote is of interest. We had to baptize the new baby. And so we discussed, should it be tourist medicine that would have been pleasing the World Tourism Organization? Should we call it travel health? That would have pleased the World Health Organization. There was also some drive to call it emporiatrics. Emporiatrics, what's that? I had to look it up at the time in the dictionary and found out that it was linked to Old Greek language, meaning the back of a ship where the passengers would be located. I thought nobody would understand that ever. So finally, ultimately I decided that it should be called travel medicine, and that has been the name which remained. We didn't know initially whether there would be a few dozen attending that meeting. We tried to interest lots of people, and then ultimately there were almost 500 gathering in Zurich for this first meeting.
I'm going to interject right there because 1982, when this became kind of an idea that started, I wasn't born yet. But
the rest of us were, Aisha.
So I'm trying to figure out, up to 500 people. So how was this network being created and how were you communicating? This is before the time of sending an email and WhatsApp. What were the logistics in contacting everybody? And how did you guys know of each other in these situations?
Well, we knew of each other by publications which had appeared, as mentioned, in the 70s and the 80s, and then we had personal connections. But your question is very justified. At the time, there was not even a fax existing, and so we had to just send mails or send out telephone calls. And so we got together ultimately.
And Phyllis, did you do all of that?
Well, when it came time for the 91 conference, we had fax machines. So we faxed a lot, and we used CDC mail. I shouldn't say that online, but because our offices were in the old barracks at CDC, we overtook their mail, and that's what we did. We just mailed letters to everybody.
So that was the success of the Zurich meeting, which wasn't an official ISTM event, but I know that that was the place where there was a lot of discussion and planning with respect to actually establishing ISTM and then planning for the meeting in 1991 in Atlanta. So maybe Herb, I don't know if you, or Bert, sorry, if you have something that you can tell us with respect to that, because you were one of the key players, I know, with respect to those plans.
Well, I think the key person in organizing the early conferences was Robert, and working with Hans and with Phyllis in Atlanta and getting that organized. I came on board. I was working with Robert on research. We were talking about the need for, I was particularly interested in establishing a society. And Robert was focused on the conferences, was his primary interest. And so we decided to inaugurate this new society in Atlanta. Phyllis, everything was dumped on Phyllis to establish the meeting in Atlanta. That was in her hands, and Hans Lobel was supposed to help her, but I don't think he ever did. I think it was all Phyllis.
I think
And
Phyllis was voluntold.
yeah, and not only that, but all her personal wealth was put in jeopardy uh, because she guaranteed the rooms at the Marriott.
What was the
But
reason? Like, why did you want a society? Like, what was the need or what was the lay of the land at that time that was driving your want for this?
well, I had been working with the newly created Infectious Disease Society of America and saw how that organization grew. And I was on the council, then I was secretary, which is really the president who runs the organization, then became the president. And we bought the Journal of Infectious Diseases, and Ed Cass, who was a member of our early team, started a new journal called Reviews of Infectious Diseases, and that morphed into Clinical Infectious Diseases. And I saw in the textbooks of infectious diseases that were created, all of these shaped the field of infectious diseases. And I felt travel medicine was somewhat nebulous, the boundaries of it. I mean, it either is everything in the world or it's narrow. We didn't know exactly how it should be, but I thought having a journal and having a textbook would help define the boundaries of this specialty. And I'd seen it with infectious diseases. And so that was my background and what I was pushing with Robert.
Fantastic. Yeah, it's just amazing how everything built up so quickly in my mind with respect to, I joined, I think, in 1993 or 1994. And it was because I was doing an elective with Jay Keystone, who was instrumental in helping out, I know, for meetings. And Phyllis, I know how much you and Jay worked together to make meetings and other things happen with respect to ISTM, and was voluntold to go to the meeting and do things at the meeting as well. But nothing like what you did for Atlanta. So maybe you can talk to us a little bit about that, what that was like being saddled with creating a meeting, a scientific meeting for a group when you really had no idea how many people might show up or what might happen.
Well, as Robert said before, there were a number of pivotal things that happened. The first was that, as he said, the way people communicated was by phone or letter. And a friend of mine in New York called me and said, "Oh, there's going to be this meeting in Zurich. It's about travel medicine. Isn't that cool?" She had started a travel clinic in New York, and I was always interested in travel and emerging diseases, and I said, "Sure, I'll go." I met Robert, I met Jay, I met David Shlim, I met a number of people, and Hans, who I knew before, just casually, because I had worked a little bit in the malaria branch, and went home, and Hans called me up, came over to my clinic and said, "Well, it looks like we're going to be doing the next meeting." And it was a matter of youth. It wasn't that I was sophisticated in any way, had experience in doing this. It's not like Bert or Robert, who have been working in this area for decades. I was very young. So I said, "Sure, that sounds like a great idea." So he handed it to me on a platter. And so the first thing I did was gather some people at CDC, Susan Stokes, who was really our first administrator, a volunteer, and Hans and Jay, and we did communicate by fax and sent little New Yorker jokes back and forth to one another by fax and planned meetings. And that's what we did. I went over to the largest hotel in Atlanta then, which was the Marriott Marquis that had opened recently. It had about 900 rooms. And I said, "Oh, this would be a great place to have a meeting." So, as you know, signed on the dotted line and said, "We're having a meeting here. We'll take all the conference rooms. We'll have coffee. We'll do this. We'll do that. And there's no problem." And I don't think at one minute I thought about what that meant that I signed a piece of paper, um, because because there was no one within the department at Emory University who was willing to back this. They basically looked at me and said, "What the hell did you do?" Um, so there it was. At that time, money was a little bit easier. So I made appointments for with every president and vice president of every company I could think of in Atlanta. And thankfully, we have Coca-Cola, and we have CNN, and we have Delta Airlines, and we have a number of other companies. And I knocked on doors and knocked on doors and knocked on doors. And something that I dislike doing intensely more than anything else is asking people for money. It's not my forte. I sort of left most of the organizing of the scientific program to the gentleman who had more experience, obviously, in the field, and that worked out well. I had an idea about workshops because I guess I did a lot of teaching in an interactive way. So it wasn't only didactic lecturing. Um, we decided to have workshops, which I think that was a contribution that at least I could make. Uh,
Did you end up filling up all the conference rooms? How many people
that
attended
and
them?
more because we had standing room only. It was extraordinary. Robert let me know in February that there was a Gulf War. We knew that was a Gulf War,
So
but
this was, what year was this? 1991 then?
correct. It was early in 1991. Robert said, because of the Gulf War, um, people weren't going to be traveling. We may have a problem, and you may have a problem, Phyllis. So, thankfully, things calmed down within the next few months, and we were shocked. We were really shocked because we had well over 800. We filled the hotel. We filled all the conference rooms with 850 something people from over 50 countries.
Wow.
And this is where really Bert and Robert made such an impression in gathering these people together and creating a society. Um, we did have, we were surprised because we actually made a fair amount of money. We made as much money as we used. And so what we did was we took it and we formed a nonprofit through the US and Georgia to have an official International Society of Travel Medicine, retained a lawyer, put money in an investment account, and started working from the barracks of the malaria branch. That's how it happened. In the meanwhile, I met Nancy Jenks, and
Say, how did I want to hear Nancy's.
Nancy is a nurse practitioner with a lot of experience in seeing different populations than most of us saw. And we realized that the nursing contingency, at least in the United States, was huge. It was going to be huge in travel medicine.
Mhm.
And she really spearheaded that and was a huge advocate as well for women in the field.
So
So I'll
Nancy,
stop there.
where did you enter into this pictures?
Phyllis is giving me much credit. But I wanted to back up just a little bit. I mean, in terms of before I even got into anything with healthcare or medicine, as a traveler, and a lot of people that are watching this probably think travel medicine, that's old stuff, but it really wasn't. And I remember Phyllis and Robert when they wrote that wonderful. The first program from the first ISTM meeting came along with it a whole book of articles and research that had, I don't know if it had been published or that book is published. We'll have to find out about that. But I remember in the preface, it said, Phyllis was saying in the preface that travel medicine was always kind of a cottage industry. People were getting recommendations for travel from just different people, and there was nothing really organized. And in 1974, I was living in France, and I decided to go to East Africa for the summer. And I was told, well, you need a yellow fever shot. Well, I didn't know what yellow fever was. I was a French literature major, and but I was told to go down to Paris. I went down to Paris on the day. I stood in line with about 100 people, literally. Was kind of finally got my turn to go into sort of a stall where the nurse said undress from the waist up. I thought I had misunderstood the French. And suddenly the door behind me swung open and jabbed me with a shot in the back and handed me a card. And that was travel medicine. And I went popping off to East Africa for the summer and did fine. And then a year later, I joined the Peace Corps, and it was kind of similar. I show up in Philadelphia before I'm headed off to Senegal, and I'm in the lobby with a nurse getting jabbed with cholera, typhoid, rabies, every vaccine on the menu, and then sent off to Senegal. And that was travel medicine. And then flipping 10 years further along the line in the 80s, I got married. We had our first son, and he was 4 months old. And my husband was with the UN. We were posted in Kathmandu. And by now I was a nurse practitioner, so I knew a little bit about medicine, but I'd only been practicing maybe 3 or 4 years. And I wanted to find out how to keep my parents' first grandchild alive. And I didn't know what he needed in the way of vaccines. My pediatrician certainly had no idea even where Nepal was, much less what 4-month-old needed to travel to Nepal. So anyway, after a while, I contacted a friend of mine who's a physician, and her husband also a pediatrician, and worked for CDC actually, and called me and told me, okay, this is what he needs. And showing up in Kathmandu, and then I'll stop. My husband trotted off to the UN, and I'm sitting there with this baby thinking, okay, now what am I going to do? And I had David Schlim's number, and I called him up. One of the doctors at Seawick Clinic had just left, and David said, well, come down, I'd like to meet you.
And just for our listeners, tell us who David Shlim is.
Oh, David Shlim is a wonderful physician, and he has a long history in Nepal. He first served at a high altitude rescue point near the base of Mount Everest in the early 80s. And then he became the director of Seawick Clinic in Kathmandu, where he did a tremendous amount of research amongst travelers and really laid the groundwork for a lot of the very important studies that have been done going forward. David was also a founding member of ISTM. In fact, he was at the Zurich meeting with Robert Steffen.
Back then he rode a motorcycle and wore leather pants. Yes.
Yeah, and was in a rock band. David Shlim ran Seawick Clinic, which is one of the biggest travel clinics in the world still. He hired me. And then I saw the other flip side, because at Seawick Clinic, we took care of not only the expats, but all the travelers. So I would see on a daily, first of all, David taught me really, because I didn't know, I had never seen typhoid, dengue. We had cases of malaria from travelers from other parts of the world. We saw a lot there besides the family medicine. But anyway, suddenly I appreciated the fact that we had people traveling all over, not just Nepal, but Asia, that had no idea what they were doing and had not gotten any recommendations. And really were getting sick. Back then we didn't have Hep A vaccines, so people, they may or may not have had a gamma globulin shot to protect them. We saw a lot of Hep A, we saw tons of typhoid. But the point is that I really appreciated that travel medicine was a niche that was not being fulfilled. And I came back to the States at the late 80s, and in 1991 the phone rang and David called and said, Nancy, we're going to have a reunion down in Atlanta. There's a meeting down there and you have to come. So I went down to see all my old buddies that I worked with in Nepal and met Phyllis.
That's one of the things that's so incredible, I think, about the International Society of Travel Medicine. You talk about these networks and people that you meet and how these connections are made. And I think this is really the gem, really, of the International Society of Travel Medicine, right, Anne? Like, to this day, the incredible international network of practitioners in this field who are doing incredible things in the far reaches and far corners of the world are literally connected by a phone call away or a text message away, transferring knowledge and information and providing assistance and need to travelers around the world. I think this is really an incredible feat that has happened, but it was out of these natural connections.
I think it's not only to travelers, it's to each other. I mean, the one thing about ISTM, I always say there are often people I probably would have chosen as friends anyway, when you got together because of this common interest. And it's the welcoming, the mentorship. People are so generous with their time and inclusivity with respect to research and publishing and really helping people along with their careers. It's been amazing. And plus, as you can see by the people in the room here, still involved in travel medicine, just about to do our 20th conference next year. And everybody is still involved. If they're still around, they're still involved, is what I usually say.
Well, it's an incredible knowledge base of expertise as well, right? Like that's the thing, is that everybody brings something different at such a level of depth, and a lot of members of the society are in really key positions and leadership positions around the world in huge organizations such as the Centers for Disease Control and the World Health Organization and GeoSentinel, and all the way down to, those clinics that are in little house, rooms, right? Like, we're down to those little clinics and shacks maybe who are giving those vaccines in remote places. That connection is still there. So that's, I think, one of the things that for me really stands out about one of the golden threads of the International Society. So you're talking about we're coming into the 20th meeting, Anne. So what happened after Atlanta? How many more meetings, or how often were these meetings being scheduled after that?
Well, I think it was decided that the meetings would be every other year. And what was decided, and feel free to jump in there, Robert, that we would have meetings alternating between basically Europe and North America, so that most people would have an opportunity, if not to go each time, to go when it reached their continent. We are trying, thanks to Anne, to move out of just that geographic area and change our boundaries and have the next meeting in Bangkok. But also there have been a number of regional meetings. And perhaps, Robert, you can speak to that because you've been involved in a number of them.
Yes, actually, after Atlanta, the next meeting was a particular challenge because that was in Paris, France. And I was very much involved in that and had hours of discussion with our French colleagues, because initially they absolutely urged us that the meeting should be in French, possibly with a little English, but French should be dominating. And of course, we who had a more intercontinental vision of the meetings urged them to have it in English. And after lengthy discussion, we achieved that the meeting was in English, and there were just a few excursions within Paris which were conducted in French, and that was it. The subsequent one went to Acapulco.
Oh, Mexico.
Acapulco, that was, and here I return to Hans Lobel, his idea, his wish, his vision, because he wanted to go to Acapulco. And actually, that created some problems with respect to the number of delegates, because many of the heads of the travel clinics told their staff, Acapulco? Are you going on a vacation? Or what's that? And so there was some obstruction, particularly to the younger colleagues, that they would join us as well, but Acapulco happened. And from then on, every now and then, we also had regional meetings, be that in Australia, in South Africa, excellent meetings, by the way, there. Also in Asia, and very recently, we had a regional meeting in Rio de Janeiro, and attended that as well, and Aisha as well. So maybe you want to comment on that one. And the next upcoming meeting actually is going to take place in October of this year in Dar es Salaam, organized by the Pan-African Travel Medicine Federation and supported by Yamat, who has been mentioned before as well. And so we who are involved in the society got our fair share of travel and meeting with those colleagues you mentioned, Aisha and Anne, who became not only colleagues, but very often also friends.
So I just want to go back to something that I think both you, Robert, and Bert talked about when we talked about planning the early meetings, and especially if something wasn't going along to plan, you couldn't take care of it by fax or by phone. You actually had to hop on an airplane and show up face to face and get in a closed sort of meeting with everybody in the room. And that one big example of that, as you said, was Paris, when you tried to convince them that maybe it shouldn't only be in French, it may not work, right? The importance of, I mean, obviously life has changed here for us with Zoom and everything else, but the importance of that human connection, face-to-face connection, to actually be able to get people all on the same page and work together was so important and continues to be so important.
Considering that this was, you know, that little twinkle in the eye back in the 80s for you, looking now and seeing how this has developed over the years, what would you say have been your most proud moments or the most memorable things for you in the society?
I'm very happy that this society still exists, that it flourishes. Okay, it has had a crisis during the COVID pandemic, but it is coming up again. I'm extremely happy about the fact that it remains an intercontinental society. But on the other hand, I'm somehow sad that actually there are so few Europeans as members in the society, and that is associated with the fact that in Europe we have very strong national societies. For instance, the German Society of Travel Medicine has more than 1,000 members, whereas in ISTM, I think there are less than 20 members from Germany. And so we have still some convincing work to do so that, for instance, more Europeans and more also colleagues from Latin America, from Africa, from Asia join the society on long term.
And Bert, for you, what has been your most proud moments, or when was the moment when you think that you realized that this had arrived, that travel medicine had arrived to what you had envisioned?
I think the meetings and the Journal of Travel Medicine have been extremely successful. Those two things are really, and there are other parts to the association that are very, very, very good. But those two, for me, I was most proud about. The other thing is the research collaboration that occurred. Robert and I were already working together, but we began to work with a lot of people that were members of the ISTM in Asia and in Africa, working in Traveler's Diary together. And we would meet at the ISTM meetings and plan some of these research projects. So the question was me personally. And so those were the things that I think were most important to me.
Phyllis, for you, when I think about the massive amount of work you've done for ISTM and continue to do, I think about two things in particular, GeoSentinel and the exam, right? So are those two of the most memorable, or are there other things for you that really stand out?
I think you've got it right there, Anne. After the Atlanta conference, there was a lot of activity, certainly. We talk about the first decade, I would say. In 1993, Martin Cetron, who was in the Division of Global Migration and Quarantine at CDC, had heard that their Congress had allotted money to develop surveillance within the United States for emerging and reemerging diseases. They were going to give money to people and networks that could do this because they had decided that the U.S. could no longer monitor what was going on in the rest of the world as far as disease transmission. So David Friedman and Marty and I got together and we wrote a proposal to CDC, and it was to Congress, of what we would like to do, a fantasy, basically. And initially we were not funded, but right after the initial allotment of money that went out, they came back to us and said, this is something we need. We can't do it alone with pediatric emergency rooms. So we created something called GeoSentinel, and initially they just wanted U.S. sites, North American sites. And so we asked 10 of our friends who we knew from the ISTM. Who else would we ask? Practitioners in clinical tropical medicine, basically, who were seeing people who returned from travel, who had crossed an international border and were ill. And what we did was we developed a form on paper, and everybody would fill out the form about their patient, de-identified without their names on it, and fax it, okay? And fax it to our office at CDC, where we collected these pieces of paper and wrote down where people were from, when the dates of travel, their illness, all of this. And then CDC, we asked CDC if we could do this internationally, because what was the sense of doing surveillance of emerging and reemerging diseases if we only had US practitioners? So Jay Keystone came on board from Canada, and then gradually Frank von Sonnenberg was our first site director in Munich, and we were able to gradually expand to now about 70 sites worldwide. We have probably about 500,000 entries. We took a while to get people on board to computers where all of this information was put into a computer. We had we hired somebody, a contractor, who developed the first computers for Coca-Cola, and they kept the secret sauce that goes into Coke in each country that's slightly different. And he developed our first program. But most people weren't on the internet, so we couldn't use it anyway. So it was this funky combination of computer and paper that everybody had. We finally moved to computer and brew, and as everybody suggested, we were able to grow from the corner candy store like ISTM to a professional organization, and it's still going through. I would call GeoSentinel, hopefully soon, GeoSentinel 3.0, with a total redo of the computers and the programs, and bringing on more people and doing a whole lot more. We've got a lot of grants in, and it's been an exciting time for GeoSentinel. So that was a big one. The exam came a little bit later in the 1990s, and that was an outgrowth of a meeting in Paris, actually, where this was discussed and was very controversial about trying to start an exam. We knew that the American Society of Tropical Medicine had an exam. Obviously, the Infectious Disease Society had an exam for fellowship for the fellows. And we said, well, why don't we sort of do it as a proposal? Had a meeting. Robert was very instrumental in that as well, where we decided, Alan McGill was president at the time, where we decided, let's just try to move forward. Again, money was a little bit easier then. Sanofi Pasteur awarded grant to hire the testing firm that ASTM&H used. They gave us permission to go to the same organization, and we sat together and wrote an exam. Developed a body of knowledge in travel medicine that Bert and Robert had thought about previously, and I think Nancy was on one of those committees writing the exam, and we were able to give it first in 2003 in New York. Again, fearing that nobody would sign up for it, have an exam, and nobody wants to take an exam. It's another scary proposition. And we were shocked. We filled a ballroom with 450 people to take that first exam, and it's been going since. So
Yeah, and with that goal to really standardize international care and standardize the
absolutely,
knowledge, right? Which is so key when you're dealing with people from all over the world. So
absolutely.
it's really,
We had to deal with issues such as language again, and giving adequate time and having the language appropriate for international people. So those were huge challenges. Um, and again, we had difficulty because the Canadians also wanted it in French. um, but we couldn't do it. So there you have it.
Nancy, how about you?
yeah. And Nancy also, just to add on to that, Anne, is that Phyllis and Nancy got into this so young.
Mhm.
And they make a point when they came in 1974 that they were much younger than Robert and Bert. So, but
I
but
was
Nancy,
I was in live, but not in high school yet, I'd like to say.
I wasn't there. But Nancy, the other thing I want to know and is basically like, what would you tell, what advice would you give your younger self starting in this field now, or what would you advise, somebody younger now entering this field as well, given, where you guys started at when you first entered and joined the society?
I don't know really if I'd have advice. I mean, I think, as everyone here has said, to hang out with really smart people who love to travel. I mean, you can't go wrong with that one. We've made some incredible friendships. And I think what really struck me also is the women within the society and how that really branched out. I think we started seeing little niches of travel within travel medicine, including travel for women. And suddenly people were emerging. Elaine Jung was one of the leaders. Mary Wilson, of course, Pat Schlagenhoff.
Susan
We've had
Anderson.
Michelle Berry. I mean, we've had incredible women in it from the get-go who really spoke a lot, I think, to women's issues. And also the education piece. I mean, Phyllis has been such a leader, and I remember I think the nurses in Europe were much more involved really in travel medicine. There was Jane Chinadini and Sandra Greaves and Fiona, who of course became the president of ISTM at one point. But I think U.S. nurses were a little bit kind of on the sideline, and I don't know. Phyllis, correct me if I'm mistaken, but with your travel clinic, I mean your travel practice at Emory, and with the corporations you worked with, I think you saw what the role of nurses could be in travel medicine, and what an important piece they had in terms of not just poking people or jabbing them with a vaccine, but really a lot of the educational piece. And I remember very early on, and Phyllis really supporting Rebecca Acosta and many of the really wonderful U.S. nurses who were very much involved in this, and really supporting them to integrate them into the society and create a place for them to be part of both research and really look how they've done a lot in the area of education. So I know that everybody was very grateful. And the U.S. nurses then went on to begin an organization of the American Society of Travel Health Nurses. And that's been very successful over the years as well. So I think education and women were really an important piece to the history of travel medicine.
I just want to add one memory for me from when I started, when I remember Jay's admin at that time, Anne, who did so much, your admin, Phyllis, who did so much, and Brenda Bagwell, who ran ISTM from her kitchen dining table and was so embarrassed when somebody came, I think from Southeast Asia, they came to Atlanta and they were so excited to go visit ISTM headquarters, and they knocked on her front door, and she opens her front door and says, "What are you doing here?" Right? So we've come a long way. We no longer have bricks and mortar in the world of virtual offices, but we've come a long way with our administrative help. But the beginnings, it was all sort of cobbled together, and it's amazing all the work all of you guys did. And it's amazing the connections for you, for Phyllis with CDC, Robert with WHO. Those really helped. The same thing for me here in Ottawa with Health Canada and Public Health Agency of Canada. Just really made inroads to make things work, I think, for travel medicine. So thank you all for all you've done.
So I'm going to throw a little twist in here now. I mean, Anne, I feel like this is like, the ghost of past, present, and future. As you may or may not know, Anne is the current president of the International Society of Travel Medicine. So come a long way from the beginnings of how this all started. If there was one thing you guys could say to Anne going forward in regards to what you would like to see or how you want the future or vision to evolve of travel medicine, what is it that you would say to Anne as she carries your torch forward? It's a hard one, sorry. We can start with Anne if you want to say your vision and then go from there.
I think my vision is to expand our reach internationally and really work on that membership. As Robert said, we should have more European membership. We should have more Asian membership.
Expanding the fact that so many people believe that travel medicine is just for tourists. And we all here know that that's not the case. There's so many different kinds of people who cross borders, and to educate the public.
The practice of travel medicine should become even more evidence-based as compared to what it is now. I still see that in various parts of the world, many practitioners in travel medicine just follow some, what I would call, tradition. For instance, immunizing everybody against typhoid fever, although at the destination there is hardly any typhoid fever, as for instance in the Caribbean.
I think with technology now, we could do a lot more. Most practices, all practices now are using EMRs, and there's no reason that there shouldn't be more developed in that line. So I would love to see travel medicine integrated in a sort of easier, seamless way into primary care practice.
And as I think about it, and you that work more internationally than I do now may know other organizations that have been successful, bridging countries, all over the countries from all over the world. But this is a big challenge. And I think much more could be done in publishing what the ISTM has done and what it is. And I can see major journals having interest in this.
One of the things I just want to point out for listeners is the thing that really impresses me about ISTM is it's not only trying to reach out across continents and include multiple countries, but travel medicine is practiced by so many different people within medicine. So it's not, only physicians or physicians and nurses, it's pharmacists. Now there's even some other people that might be getting involved. And I think that's a whole nother layer of complexity with respect to trying to reach those people.
So thank you to all of you for coming onto this podcast today and sharing your experiences and the history. And thank you also for really laying down the foundational framework for this society. And I'm sure it's been amazing for you all to see how it's evolved and change. And I think, and for you to be carrying it forward is special as well. And so to wrap this up, I think what started as a small group of clinicians recognizing a gap has really grown into this global force shaping how we protect travelers and understand disease across borders. The story of the International Society of Travel Medicine is really the story of a field coming into its own, moving from fragmented knowledge to a coordinated, evidence-driven discipline. But as we've heard today, the work is far from done. And as travel evolves, so must we. Travel is changing, climate is reshaping risk, and global mobility continues to challenge how we think about health. So the next chapter of travel medicine will require the same curiosity and collaboration and bold thinking that really defined its beginnings by really these key players all over the world. And maybe that's the real takeaway here, that this field has always been built by people willing to look ahead. So travel medicine was never just about where people go. It's about what moves with them. And as long as the world keeps moving, this field will matter more than ever. So thank you again. And we hope that you've learned something today from all of us. And we really hope to be able to carry this legacy and this torch forward.
Thanks, everybody.
So that's a wrap for this episode. Thank you to our sponsor, the International Association for Medical Assistance to Travelers, located on the web at iamat.org. Don't forget to follow Travel Unravelled on Spotify and on Apple Podcasts or on your favorite podcast platform. We'll post fun clips and extra resources on the ISTM website located at learning.istm.org/podcast. We're also on Facebook, LinkedIn, X, and Instagram at _ISTM_. Finally, and thankfully, Travel Unravelled is produced by Ghost Bureau out of Toronto at ghostbureau.com.
Please remember that the information presented in this podcast is intended for educational and informational purposes only. It should not be considered medical advice, nor is it intended to replace consultation with a qualified healthcare professional. The views expressed by the hosts and guests of this podcast are their own and do not necessarily reflect the opinions or policies of the ISTM or any medical or other health professionals, hospitals, clinics, or healthcare facilities. While we strive to provide accurate and up-to-date information, the medical field is constantly evolving, and there may be new findings or developments not included in our content. We encourage our listeners to consult with their healthcare providers for any medical concerns or before starting any new treatment. Neither the ISTM nor any of its affiliates, sponsors, producers, hosts, or guests are liable for any direct, incidental, consequential, indirect, or punitive damages arising out of access to, use of, or inability to use the content of this podcast, or any errors or omissions in the content hereof. By listening to this podcast, you agree not to use this information as a substitute for, nor does it replace professional, medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always consult with your healthcare providers for guidance appropriate to your specific health situation. Thank you for listening to Travel Unravelled. We are committed to sharing knowledge and fostering discussion in the pursuit of better health and well-being.